Hello friends, followers, fellow lovers of jewelry and weird historical nonsense, and welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, the only podcast where you get to learn about jewelry history and just why Queen Victoria had so many children in one episode. Hint, it wasn't because she liked kids. As always, I'm Melise, a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques and more than a little obsessed with jewelry history. This episode is a continuation of the last one, where we started to get into the history of body piercing, starting with ear piercing, earlobe stretching, nostril, and septum piercing. This episode is going to have some briefer histories, but more of those self-inflicted wounds, focusing on the often false mythology surrounding lip piercing, nipple piercing, and even genital piercing, as I so dramatically promised in the last episode. You don't have to listen to episode 1 to enjoy this one, but why wouldn't you? Are you only here for the nipple and genital piercings? Patreon subscribers, there is currently a poll up to determine what the next podcast is going to be about. Since I've posted these episodes 2 weeks in a row, I've shifted the podcast publishing schedule a bit to accommodate some of my travel. So the next one won't be released next Wednesday, but on Wednesday, October 16th. The topics include the filigree mystery. How did so many cultures independently adopt this technique? Cross-cultural dialogue. What jewelry inspiration did ancient civilizations take from their neighbors and enemies? And reuse and recycle. How jewelry components get remade into new pieces across the centuries. If you're a paid Patreon subscriber and you haven't voted yet, now is your chance. If you are not a Patreon member and you would like to be, you can head over to patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories and join the $5 a month tier to have access to a monthly bonus video, as well as the ability to vote in polls like this one. It's the only way you can have a say about what content I make. I am a stubborn girl, and I have a list of my own topics that is very long, and I've got dozens of requests coming my way every week. I am holding input hostage behind the price of a monthly cappuccino. Caffeinate me, and I will let you in on the decision-making. I said that I was stubborn, not that I couldn't be bribed with coffee. Patreon subscribers will also be getting some extra museum content this month, while I'm traveling and visiting some of the museums I've always dreamed of, like the Louvre. Once again, warning at the top, because people keep telling me they are listening to these with their children. This episode will contain spicy language, discussion of sex lives, genitalia, flippant attitudes towards the monarchy, and, as always, my generally combative attitude toward colonialism and imperialism. Tap out here if you have no desire to hear me talk about penises, or you'd like to continue imagining Queen Victoria as a demure, sweet, unproblematic historical figure. Otherwise, come with me and let's get into some of the less common, more interesting forms of body piercing, along with the myths and stories surrounding them. Out of all of the types of piercings we have left to discuss, the one that is the most widespread is the lip piercing. We've been working our way through the various piercings in the order of least to most likely to cause complications. As I said in the last episode, the earlobe and nostril are fairly low-stakes places to punch holes in yourself. The healing time is fairly quick, and as long as the wound is kept clean and taken care of, there is minimal risk of infection or other issues. Lip piercing starts to present slightly higher risks, especially if we're talking about the most common lip piercing found throughout history, the labret piercing. And before anyone sends me an exasperated message, labret and labre are both acceptable pronunciations of this word, and no, I will not be changing the way I say it. Technically, those are both wrong because the most correct way to say it in an anthropological context is labret. But, I hate that, and I won't be doing that. Anyway, a labret piercing is under the bottom lip and above the chin. Labret piercings have an incredibly long history in multiple cultures, some as far away from each other as Alaska and Africa. So let's start with Alaska. Multiple cultures of the northwestern tip of North America have been practicing labret piercing for at least 5,000 years. When Europeans and Americans arrived in Alaska, labret piercings were being worn by Tlingit women of high status, often dentalium shells, but sometimes porcupine or bird quills. A dentalium shell is the long, thin tusk or tooth-shaped shell of a particular kind of small mollusk, and it wasn't only used by the Tlingit or neighboring tribes. Other Native American tribes also used dentalium shells for their adornments, and they were very highly prized. Cultures from this part of the world practice some of the most elaborate forms of labret piercing and stretching, rivaled only by Mesoamerican, Andean, and African tribes. The Inuit people have a custom of multiple labret piercings, 2 or more piercings side by side, fitted with jewelry that is adorned with beaded fringe that hangs down to the chin. The effect is absolutely dazzling. Another form of Inuit double labret piercing involves side-by-side piercings, one under each corner of the mouth, fitted with flared, disc-shaped plugs. There are also written accounts from European explorers describing the practice of wearing multiple animal tusks, pushed through stretched labret piercings. These could be moved by pushing them around inside the mouth with the tongue. And that sounds like it would have looked rather intimidating. Another culture that understood the power of a moving lip ornament was the Mexica people of Mexico, known to most as the Aztecs. I've gotten a lot of feedback from my followers and listeners of Mexica descent, making it clear that Mexica is the correct name. I tend to prefer treating others with humanity, decency, and respect, so it's Mexica from now until forever. Please don't get at me with your justifications for why Aztec is technically correct. I'm going off of what has been communicated to me by people who have a valid reason to make the correction. The Mexica people have a long and tremendously impressive history of goldsmithing, creating incredibly detailed miniature works of wearable art, including lip plugs or labrets. For the Mexica people, the labret symbolized that you were a speaker of truth and was something that could only be worn by warriors, nobility, and royalty. A quick note, I have gotten in hot water for attempting to pronounce the Nahuatl language in the past. I have been working on it. Please bear with me. And if you have corrections, please give them kindly, and I will accept them graciously. Do not be a jerk about my inability to speak a language that I was never taught, because I'm doing my best to pronounce everything respectfully and to the best of my ability. All right. That being said, in Nahuatl, the title for royal office was Hue Tlatoani, or Great Speaker, and the adornment of the mouth was a highly symbolic aspect of this role. Labret ornaments were awarded to warriors for their courage and skill in battle, and military expertise. But the wearing of gold labrets seems to have been limited to nobility and royalty only, which is not surprising given the connection that gold had to the gods in Mexica culture. If you want to know more about that, you're going to have to go back and listen to the episode about the history of gold. One of my favorite Mexica labret ornaments is a piece held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. What's it doing there? A good question we can extend to a large chunk of their collections, but that's a podcast topic for another time. What we do know is that we are lucky it has survived intact, because most gold ornaments from the Americas were being melted down for easier transport as ingots, along with everything else that was stolen from the indigenous cultures of the Americas and sent back to fill Europe's colonial coffers. I promised myself I wouldn't drag out my fuck Christopher Columbus and everything that came after him soapbox on this episode, but it is hard. Like Napoleon, he just shows up. Columbus and the atrocities of European colonialism aside, if you can say such a thing, this labret ornament is an absolutely exquisite piece of jewelry. Crafted in the shape of a serpent rearing its head atop a curving neck, it is beautifully detailed, with exaggerated, fierce fangs and delicate carved scales. But the most intriguing feature is the large, articulated forked tongue. Worn by means of a flared base, which would have held it in place against the inside of the lip, this serpent would move its tongue along with the wearer, emphasizing the pure and honest speech that was expected of whoever was wearing it. The Met made a cute little video of it wagging its tongue, and I will include that in this week's photo slideshow to accompany this episode. I'll be posting that on my Instagram. One of my earliest videos is also about this specific piece. If you want to watch me absolutely murder the Nahuatl language while wearing a very pretty vintage Mexican blouse, you can scroll back in any of my social media feeds till you find the video where my hair looks like Frida Kahlo's, and half the comments are bitching at me for getting words wrong. We can't end the section on lip piercings without discussing lip plates and some African cultural customs surrounding lip adornment. Archaeological evidence suggests that lip plates and lip piercings go back to about 5000 BCE in Sudan and Ethiopia, in contrast to the 1500 BCE estimate we get for the Americas. These lip plates can be so large in size that in some cultures, they require the surgical removal of 2 or 4 front-bottom teeth. Because of the widespread practice amongst multiple cultures and how long this form of adornment has been practiced, the social significance of lip plates has shifted and changed over time and location. It's been theorized that, in some cultures, the size of the lip plate denotes social status, but it's also entirely likely that, due to the mechanics of how lip stretching works, larger and larger plates would eventually be necessary. The Surma and Mursi people, who live in the lower Omo River Valley of Ethiopia, have a practice wherein a young woman has her lip pierced by a relative, about 6 to 12 months before marriage. The piercing is gradually stretched over this time, as it heals, and is eventually adorned with a lip plate crafted by the wearer herself, who would, of course, take great pride in it. And now we move on to a type of piercing that doesn't really seem like it would have that long of a history. The nipple piercing. And yet, we're about to talk about Julius Caesar? Here's where I have to give you all a full no fun warning. Just about everything we're about to discuss, every bit of history pertaining to nipple piercings, every single myth and story, is total and utter bullshit, made up during the 20th century by people who had an interest in, and profited off of, popularizing body piercing. So basically, this whole section about nipple piercings is going to be a takedown of how they don't actually have this wild historical background. Sorry. I do love to burst a misinformation bubble though, so at the very least, I'm having fun here. We're just going to get through these one by one. First off, the persistent myth that a queen named Isabeau of Bavaria popularized the practice in the 14th century, with her love for very low-cut dresses. The story is that women were wearing dresses with such a low-cut bodice that it revealed their nipples, and of course, those nips now had to be ornamented in order to be worthy of the royal court. There's even a description of young women threading diamond-studded gold chains between their nipple piercings. This is absolute bullshit, but can we please make that last thing a reality? Is anyone threading diamond-studded gold chains between their nipple rings, and if not, why not? There's also an oft-repeated myth that Victorian-era society women were getting their nipples pierced in the late 1800s, as a sort of secret thrill. Also total bullshit. These stories can be traced back to the 1890s equivalent of penthouse letters, so they're just someone else's sordid fetish fantasy. To any of my listeners who are too young to know what penthouse letters are, go ask your dad. I'm sure he'd love to explain it to you. Here's a consolation prize, though not quite piercing specific. It is nipple-related, though. Agnès Sorel, born in 1422 and eventually the chief mistress of Charles VII of France, is often claimed to have had her dresses specifically tailored in order to show off her favorite breast, the left one. This, of course, is not quite true, and it's a myth born of two things that did actually happen. Agnès did like to wear incredibly low-cut dresses and popularized the fashion in the French royal court, dresses low enough to show off a nipple or two, for sure. I do think that she was the inspiration behind the Isabeau of Bavaria myth. The second thing that actually happened is a painting of Agnès as the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus by Jean Fouquet, depicting her as lactating with one perfect breast exposed, the left one. I think Agnes's love for scandalously low-cut dresses, coupled with this painting, not only created the myth of the breast-bearing dress, but eventually the one about court women threading diamond-studded gold chains between their nipple piercings. Especially because Isabeau was married to Charles VII's predecessor, Charles VI. I did mention Julius Caesar a few paragraphs back, so let's get back to that, and what it even has to do with nipple piercing. There is a persistent, visually ridiculous myth that Roman soldiers pierced their nipples in order to have something to fasten their cloaks to. I just love this one because it's an astonishingly stupid idea. There is so much potential for this to go wrong, for someone to be injured. It gives people a great place to hang onto if they wanted to do some major damage. But it's a myth that has persisted, so clearly there are people out there who think this is a practical way to wear a cape. There's also a myth that the same soldiers did it to demonstrate their masculinity and virility. And my very favorite myth that Julius Caesar had his nipples pierced for the same reason, and to show solidarity with his soldiers. I invite everyone to take a moment to imagine a shirtless Julius Caesar with a purple cape attached to his nipple rings. Some people think jewelry history is boring, and they have no idea what they're missing out on. One of the few myths that holds water, stupid pun intended, is the one about sailors piercing their nipples to commemorate crossing the equator, much like their ear-piercing rituals. I will believe just about anything you tell me about sailors, given the mixing of cultural ideas and mores, but this one does seem to track. It's generally pretty well known that the Victorian era, the time period during which Queen Victoria reigned as Queen of England, from 1837 to 1901, is considered a time of excessive prudishness, strict moral codes, and an emphasis on purity. Victoria herself was quite the tastemaker of her time, popularizing all manner of things from jewelry and fashion trends to the way mourning periods were observed after the death of a loved one. Brace yourselves, because this is where it gets weird, uncomfortable, hilarious. Your call. It might surprise you to know that Queen Victoria really liked sex. I mean, she fucked only one guy, and she was understandably devastated when he died, and then she didn't have sex with anyone ever again, but everyone's favorite kleptomaniac queen was very much into having sex with her husband, Prince Albert. By all accounts, the two of them were very much in love during their entire marriage, and there were 9 children to show for it. Queen Victoria apparently hated being pregnant. She really resented it, both the experience and the fact that, during the Victorian era, pregnant women were cautioned not to have sex, and she wasn't exactly a fan of children either. When she was told that she had to stop getting pregnant, and was asked if she knew what that meant, she answered, quote-unquote, "No more fun in bed." What does this have to do with anything aside from being one of the most humanizing facts about Queen Vicky? Her husband, Prince Albert, which is also the name of a type of fairly popular penis piercing. Penis piercings, despite seeming very edgy and alternative and modern, do have a very, very, very long history. Potentially the longest of any piercing we've discussed. It's been practiced to make sex more pleasurable, prevent sex and masturbation, as a symbol of virility, a form of religious worship supposedly engaged in by certain Greek monks who would wear rings weighing 1/4 of a pound. It seems you can do quite a bit with penis piercing. Evidence of penis piercing and scarification can be found dating back over 11,000 years. In ancient Rome, performers and comedians would wear what are described as pins in their members, apparently to enhance their sexual attractiveness. I guess sleeping with actors and comedians was the thing to do. Those pins would be removed before sex, but in ancient India, pins were not removed. And it's written that there were some adherents of the Kama Sutra who believed that true pleasure could not be experienced without a penis piercing. In the Victorian era, and during the early 20th century, it was employed as a means of preventing masturbation and sex. But why is a Prince Albert called Prince Albert? Sometime in the 1970s, when this piercing was being popularized again, because make no mistake, this is an ancient form of piercing, it gained a fun backstory for the Victoriana-obsessed 1970s. That this style of piercing was invented by Prince Albert to, shall we say, tame his oversized member so that it could fit into his tight trousers without showing as much of a bulge. Clearly, this is born of the open secret of the Queen and Prince Consort's very active marriage bed. Maybe I'm not imaginative enough, but it seems to me like Prince Albert having a Prince Albert would have made the bulge that much more visible, and now confusingly so. There's evidence that this style of piercing was originally intended to be used to bind the penis to something, and it definitely dates back at least 2,000 years. And this, my friends, is where we end, at Prince Albert's monstrously large penis. The story about the piercing is absolutely not true, but I do wonder if there's a kernel of truth in there. Was Prince Albert as confusingly hung as Willem Dafoe in Antichrist? My search history for this episode is already so weird, and I really don't want to delve any deeper into it. I hope you enjoyed this episode, which is definitely some of the most fun I've had with the podcast so far, researching and giggling at the mental image of Roman soldiers with capes attached to their nipples. Every once in a while, someone is taken aback when I curse or I talk shit about colonialism, etc., etc., etc. But the truth is, this is what history is like. Things are weird, messy, naked, sexual, oftentimes strange. And jewelry is a part of that. It's a crucial part of that. If you liked what you heard, please leave me a rating and review wherever you're listening. And please consider subscribing if you haven't already. You can find the Ancient History Jewelry Stories video series on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under moonhoney.jewelry. You can find my Patreon page at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. And if you'd like to see my goldsmithing work and the jewelry that I make, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and hopefully giggling along. And I'll be back in 2 weeks with a topic chosen by you, my lovely Patreon subscribers. And, of course, for more ancient history jewelry stories.